Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, July 26, 2013. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today here. Sam is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. And if you are watching me on video, we are trying a new system today. It's called BAM User. I cannot tell you how many complaints I got about Justin TV dropping their mid-roll commercials right on top of important talking points. I was trying to get them to put their commercials on top of the RBN commercials. I didn't even get a reply. So this is our first day trying BAM User, and already very favorable impression. The technical support staff over at BAM User have answered all my emails just like lightning response, and so already I'm much happier, and the system does seem to be working just fine. So if you hear anybody screaming they can't find my show over on Justin TV, there's a very good reason for that. It's not there any longer. We're on BAM User. And anyway, getting on to some news here. Looking at the American stock market, it's a bit of a roller coaster. Opened, dropped rather sharply, and then the plunge protection team, of course, is earning their living today and trying to drive it back up for that usual traditional historical Friday happy ending. They're going to massage the markets to get that happy ending, because if the stock market were allowed to drop, those Wall Street firms that have been buying huge blocks of stock to keep that market up would be instantly insolvent. So they're gaming that, just the way they rig the gold prices and the way they rig the LIBOR and the rest of that. Now, interesting little story. This is kind of on an up mode. I'm taking it probably a little out of sequence from where I would normally put it. But there's a company out there called Honest Tea. It's a cute little name, and for the last 4 years, they have conducted an experiment. They'll put up these little unmanned kiosks in shopping malls. There's no sales staff to harass you, just a little kiosk, and there are packages of their product, and the sign says you're allowed to take one, and please put $1 in this little box, on the honor system. And Hawaii tied with Alabama for most honest state. Everybody who took the tea put the $1 in the box. Want to know who scored worst in the entire country? Washington, D.C. 20% of the people took the tea and did not pay for it. We shouldn't be surprised, of course. We shouldn't be surprised. Washington is a very dishonest city, as we have been seeing from the actions of the government locally. They're making a real big deal over this vandalization of the Lincoln Memorial. Somebody put some spatters of this light green paint on the statue of Abraham Lincoln, and there's, vandalism, how dare they. Frankly, the first picture I saw, it looked like somebody had been standing next to the monument with a lime slushie and tripped and fell. And the lime green color basically doesn't have any significance. So some kind of a stunt to give the media something to report on so they don't have to talk about the NSA and the IRS and the rest of all these other problems here. Now, interesting little story, since we're going to be getting back into Floodgate right now. This is over at Extra Public TV. And they're pointing out this very strange situation, how Nancy Pelosi is being given a great deal of credit for the House vote against the Amash Amendment, which would have curtailed the NSA's funding to spy on law-abiding American citizens who are not, in fact, suspected of any wrongdoing. And it's very interesting because Pelosi has been a vocal critic of the surveillance infrastructure. She's always out there saying this is unconstitutional. This is an abuse of the American people. And apparently behind the scenes, she was working with the members of the House to say, you better vote this down. So it would suggest to me that the NSA has got the goods on Ms. Pelosi. And as I understand it, there's a lot of goods to be had there. And that, of course, is the real danger of this unwarranted, unconstitutional surveillance on all Americans, because it does include judges, officials, elected politicians. Even Obama was subjected to surveillance, supposedly before he was a senator. Why would they stop at that point? We know from past history, the U.S. government intelligence agencies have never hesitated to dig up dirt on politicians to sway their votes and policies. J. Edgar Hoover over at the FBI was infamous for using his private secret files to influence the U.S. government, up to and including President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. So we basically have come here to a national security state where the spy agencies are calling all the shots, and the illusion that there's some kind of an elected government that's really in control of the nation is pretty much exposed as the fraud that it is. Meanwhile, the United States Senate is continuing to push sanctions on nations that might be considering aiding Edward Snowden find a place to live out the rest of his life now that he has exposed this massive spy operation to we, the American people. And I think it's kind of like the aging tiger who knows he really can't run down that elk any longer, and he just sits there and growls and snarls at everybody, because sanctions are only effective against nations that want to do business with the United States of America. And that age is pretty much over. End of World War II, Bretton Woods, everybody had to do business with the United States. But that world doesn't exist any longer. The United States doesn't manufacture products that anybody's really in a hurry to buy. The U.S. dollar is seen less and less desirable than other currencies like the yuan. And nobody wants our GMO agriculture. So they can sanction all they want. I'm sure Putin is quaking in his boots right now over the possibility of U.S. sanctions against Russia. Interesting little story, and I was actually led to this from the website crack.com, which, far from its images just lowbrow humor, very often writes some very good political commentary over there. And it led me to this story over on TheVerge.com about how the CIA, when they're not able to get what they want on you by breaking into your smartphone, your tablet, your whatever remotely, that they're still engaging in black bag operations to break into your home, to plant malware on your computer, to go through your bikini photos collection, plant bugs, copy off stuff from your machines that are not available to the internet. For those of you who are keeping your private data on USB drives that are not plugged into the computer when you're not using the data. And apparently this is all authorized by the CIA's Office of Technical Collection. And again, it is all a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment right against the government poking into your business if they don't actually have grounds to believe that you are involved in some kind of a criminal operation. So it's all of it completely unconstitutional, and all of it delegitimizes the U.S. government. If it's not playing by the constitutional rules, if it's broken that contract with the American people, it is no longer a legitimate government of this nation. And more and more Americans seem to be feeling that. I was having a conversation with our next-door neighbors who I wouldn't view as intensively politically interested, and they were just railing on about Obama's speech the other day about how we all have to make sacrifices as the first family gets ready to go off on another taxpayer-funded vacation to Martha's Vineyard. Why are we making sacrifices to cover the losses from the crimes and corruption of Wall Street, which is really what got us into this mess? The mortgage-backed security fraud of 2008 is what killed the economy. And the federal government's attitude is, well, banks are far more important than the American people, so we will take money from the American people and give it to the banks so the banks can loan it back to the American people at interest. This is their idea of sound fiscal management of the country. The only problem is most of these bankers took that money and stuck it in their own pocket. And that's why the economy didn't recover from all this looting of the American people. Over in Europe, German privacy officials are now warning other nations within the European Union they should stop sending any data to the United States or place it on U.S.-based cloud servers because of this very obvious, blatant looting of information. If you're a German company going out for an international contract against an American company, there's a very real risk your bid and your business plan will be stolen off your computer and given to your American competitor so they have an unfair advantage going into the bidding session. And this is not speculation. The U.S. government was caught doing this back at the Seattle APEC. We got to take a break for some commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to take a phone call. John in New Jersey. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
How you doing, Mr. Rivero?
Doing great.
I'm actually the co-host on a sister show. It's not directly affiliated with yours, of course, From the Trenches. I'm JD, U.S. Marine Fighting Tyranny. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we talk about your show and we mention your site all the time, so it's actually a pleasure to speak with you for once.
Well, I appreciate getting the word out there. We're all fellow travelers on the road to restoration of the Republic.
Oh, yeah, and now here's the problem. We understand that the federal government is completely criminal, period, bar none. what is a suggestion, even if it's a cursory one, by you, on how are we going to fix this?
Well, we already know that the U.S. government is arming itself and preparing itself for a war against the American people in the 50 states. They're buying all this hollow point, human-killing ammunition. The mere existence of this massive spy operation directed against law-abiding American citizens is a hallmark of tyranny, and it's a signal that they are very much afraid that the American people are fed up with life in this country under this particular regime. We already know this NSA spy system can't actually find real criminals or real terrorists. We've already proved that with our 2 NSA challenges, in which we developed just with a little bit of tinkering. We were able to come up
It was never designed to do that. It was never designed to actually capture criminals. It was designed for the suppression of Americans.
That's exactly it. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there talking about revolution, and it would be a mistake because you would be fighting the war the government is already prepared to fight. And I know it's very hard as the taxes and costs of everything go up, the quality of food, products, and services goes down. The government just more and more blatantly ignores the Bill of Rights. But I am absolutely convinced that we're basically on the verge of the complete collapse of the current system. The Federal Reserve, private central bank, and the federal government with it coming crashing down the way the former government of the Soviet Union did. And it'll destroy itself.
The host of From the Trenches talks about this all the time.
Yeah, it's just going to come crashing down. We just need to be patient and let it happen. Anybody starting violence is doing exactly what the government wants, because if there's any kind of a violent uprising, then Obama gets to declare national emergency, martial law, turn in your guns, turn in your gold, give us your kids for more wars of conquest. I think that's what they were trying to do first with Adam Kokesh's armed march into Washington, D.C. on July 4th. That fizzled because Americans saw what an obvious setup that was. And then there was this very obvious attempt by the U.S. government to try and exploit the Trayvon Martin shooting to try and fan up race riots, to try and get that going.
Absolutely. We said the race pimps were brought out.
Yeah. We know the Department of Justice was spending taxpayer dollars fanning up these protests against George Zimmerman and trying to push that whole racism issue, and the American people didn't fall for that either. So I think the majority of Americans understand now this is how the government works. Divide and conquer, create a problem that will allow the government to impose its pre-built, ready-to-go solution, which is martial law and a national emergency. At which point they can formally get rid of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and all will be well. So anyway, that is my advice and my solution, which is really to...
Wait a second. You reviewed the circumstances. We haven't spoken about what's the solution to that.
Well, my solution is patience. And don't do anything that would give the government that excuse to justify a national emergency and martial law, because right now that's the only way they can save themselves. To say national emergency, martial law, suspend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and we'll never get it back. Not that there's much left of it as it is right now. But we know this Ponzi scheme central bank cannot perpetuate much longer. We know that the stock market and our entire economy is being held together with spit and baling wire. $85 billion at least, probably more, the Federal Reserve is creating out of thin air to keep Wall Street propped up and solvent, and also several of the banks in Europe so that the credit default swaps don't trigger. They can't keep that up forever. And so...
Fully agreed.
Okay.
The economy is on the verge of imploding. The only thing holding it up, as you call it, spit and bail wire, I call it just outright fraud and manipulation. Because I do discuss this. We do a tactical report on our site, and we talk about the finances. Mm-hmm. And most people don't even realize that the U.S. government unplugged the national debt odometer at $16.7 trillion. That is, they just stopped reporting how much it was accruing each additional day. It's been 59 days now.
And they thought we wouldn't notice. They thought we wouldn't notice. Yes.
Right. They thought we wouldn't notice. We're too stupid to notice the odometer stopped. But I agree with you that you don't want to be violent, because that is the excuse they're trying to create. That is the excuse they want. But by the same token, every day we delay doing something, they're increasing their position. They're increasing the size of their surveillance system. They're acquiring more arms, more munitions. Their propaganda is effective. It is working on a segment of the population, as you talked about your very neighbor.
No. But when I was talking about my neighbor, they're angry at the propaganda. They were upset. They weren't buying this idea we all have to go on making sacrifices. And they were angry. This wasn't. Hang on. This wasn't just over the back fence chit chat. These people are angry, and we talked when we go down and do the feed the hungry programs that we're involved in. Those people are angry. The people on our side of the table handing out the food, they're angry. They know they're being lied to on an epidemic scale. They're very angry about the spying. I know the military that I've talked to around here were just absolutely incensed to learn that the NSA listens to their phone calls from the war zones back to their loved ones at home, and they're just trading the sexy talk around like it's free porn. And so people are very angry. But again, what we really should be doing right now, for those of us who are convinced this system is going to come crashing down, is just stand back and let it happen. And we should be thinking about the blueprint for the new America, which is what kind of a nation we want to build here on this land when this current regime is through thrashing around and dying. And we can take lessons from the things the Russian Republic did right, like state control of the central bank. We can learn from their mistakes. And again, when we talk about that blueprint for the new America, rule number 1, no more private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, because not once in all of history has a nation enslaved to that system been prosperous for the people. And so that's got to be our first and foremost rule.
To enslave the people. That's the whole reason for the mechanism.
That's exactly right. We fought a revolution to be free of that kind of predatory banking practices, only to have a corrupt Congress and a corrupt president sell us back into that same slavery, not once, but 3 times.
I agree, Mr. Rivera. Well, I just wanted to stop in on the show and say, we talk about you on our show. We do mention you frequently and your site and some of the articles that you post. So it was a pleasure talking with you for a few minutes. I'd like to get off the line and allow other callers on.
All right. Thank you very much. And we're going to switch over to Paul in Canada. Aloha, Paul. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. How you doing?
Doing great.
Oh, that's good. Listen, a couple of things, One thing here is, when the elites brought Hitler to power there,
yes,
they thought they were going to control him, eh?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Same thing with Mussolini. Same thing with Mussolini.
Sure. So they get into these scenarios where, they want to, suck us in, to doing something so that they can, increase their control over us.
Yes.
And they do the same thing with the leaders that are in power. So what you're saying is totally true. Sit back, let things happen, don't get suckered, and let these elites realize that they're as much susceptible to what's going on as we are, as the general public.
We have to take, I'm sorry to pull you down, but we have to take a break for commercials, pay some bills around here, and we'll be right back after these words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And quite a long time ago, when they started pushing the cloud computing, and they were just selling it as the new big thing coming on. And I expressed concern all the way back then for 2 reasons. One, obviously, if your data is on somebody else's hard drives, it's open to surveillance and spying, which is now a huge concern among other nations that have been doing business with American cloud servers. And secondarily, it almost seemed like we were being pushed back to the 1970s computer model of everybody just has a terminal and all the data and software and everything is on some giant remote mainframe somewhere else. And I viewed that as certainly a step backwards. And my concern was that as the NSA spying broke, people are going to start taking personal responsibility for their data, bring it back home, do their own backups. And apparently this is, in fact, happening. There's a story over at Boing Boing saying that this NSA spy scandal is already harming American technology companies financially. People are canceling their accounts. People are emptying out their cloud databases. And those cloud systems represent huge capital investments. And now they're not going to get a return on them out of this concern that once your data is on the cloud, it's just wide open to government surveillance. And businessmen are now all of a sudden aware that this government cannot be trusted with your personal business data. They will use it for their own financial advantage. Again, it's been demonstrated time and time again this happens. Apparently, the latest escalation coming out of this whole story is that the federal government is now demanding that web firms turn over user passwords. Now, normally when you go to someplace like Facebook or Twitter, those companies store your password in an encrypted form. And now the NSA is saying these firms are going to have to de-encrypt the passwords and make them available to the government so the government can log into your Twitter or Facebook accounts anytime they feel like it. Possibly to plant child porn. That seems to be the new epidemic where we're finding activists are being targeted for planting of child porn. Oh, he's a child pornographer. We've got to arrest him and lock him away and the rest of it. Let's grab some more phone calls here. Kevin in Washington. Kevin, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. Nice to talk to you. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you.
My friends and I religiously look at your site and appreciate it very much. Hey, I do have a couple of ideas for solutions, but a couple of quick ones. I remember at the beginning of all this how on the progressive radio stations they were pushing carbonite really hard. They were paying these hosts to get anybody, progressive or liberal or thoughtful or anti, powers that be to put all of their stuff on the carbonite cloud. I remember that one too.
Yes.
And I'm fascinated by the fact that you said something at long last that nobody's talking about, but you still didn't use the word. When you talked about the real problem with all of this surveillance society, you talked about them having the goods on somebody and having influence. J. Edgar Hoover, is the word blackmail not allowed to be used by anybody? I find it fascinating.
No, we've certainly used it. It's certainly very, very
Good.
Appropriate. Well, we use the word coercing, but that's what blackmail is.
Sure.
You will make me head of the FBI for life, or I will put out the goods on how you have been, gratifying yourself with common household appliances and small farm animals.
Yeah. I loved your opening sequence when you talked. It was one thing I wanted to call you about most, and you talked about it, but you still didn't use the word. And I've been trying to get that out. Let's bring it where it comes.
I'm not opposed to the word. Let's call it what it is. You're right. It's blackmail. That's exactly what J. Edgar Hoover was blackmailing multiple presidents of the United States of America. That's why he kept his position of head of the FBI up until the day that he died under some questionable circumstances.
Right. We found that out about that on your site yesterday. I was reading that very thing.
Yes.
One thing about the site, I would love it if there were a way, and I don't know if it's possible, for your readers to make comments or they're in a comment section on the particular posters. I'm the guy that emailed you, as a matter of fact, you had from the trenches on a bit ago. I'm the guy that emailed you about how they scrub any comments that they don't like and how that troubled me. And I would, if I didn't have to go to their site to look at comments, but I could look at comments from your readers on the various postings.
Okay, well, on my website, the members are allowed to comment on posts. The reason we don't open up commenting to everybody is because inevitably we get a flood of troublemakers who will come in and post inflammatory material just to try and wreck the image of the website. We keep very, very tight controls on our content in terms of not allowing what is obviously blatant propaganda to serve the government and the corporations to come on the website. We don't have posts about crop circles or chemtrails or HAART being a weather control machine or Elvis and his UFO or the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot's love child. That's other people have websites for that kind of material, and we're here to talk about politics. The mission of the website in this radio show is to try and convince the U.S. government not to try and solve this economic mess with a new world war because, hey, it worked the last two times, so let's just give it another go. And it's not going to work this time. This nation's going to lose this next war if it's allowed to escalate any further.
Okay, well, then solutions. And I think it's four things. And to quote one particular fictional document that says the meek shall inherit the earth, I think that we've lost on a grand scale. I think the Titanic is sinking, and it's our job to create little lifeboats that are big enough for the deck chairs and the musicians. And I think that's done with four things. One, get our own food going, aquaponics and that sort of thing. Two, get the suppressed energy technologies out and get our own energy going. 3, our own currency, and 4, our own peer-to-peer communications. If we do those 4 things, food, energy, currency, and communications, in little tiny pockets, and we don't have to make $1 million off of it or, become rich, or we just share it with our neighbors, each of the little individual communities will just drop off of their giant debt slavery machine and start getting to know each other.
No, you're absolutely right here. Do you know why they call the holiday on July 4th Independence Day as opposed to calling it Freedom Day or, hey, we kicked out the British Day? It's because under the British rule, the colonies were forced to be dependent. They were forced to be dependent on the Bank of England's banknotes lent at interest for all their commerce. They were forced to be dependent on the British East India Company for products they wanted to import to the colonies. They were forced to be dependent on the knitting mills of Manchester and Leeds in Britain for their clothing and cloth. And this enforced dependence, in order to reduce them to subservience to the economic interests of Great Britain, was really what fueled the American Revolution. And with the Revolution, the United States gained the ability to start building up its own manufacturing, to trade with anybody they wanted to at advantageous prices, and most importantly, to have this revolutionary economy in which the public currency is a public utility created by the government, spent into circulation to buy what the government needs, flow through commerce without accruing interest to a private central bank, then taxed back at the end to balance the books and close the cycle. And that revolutionary economic system has been the target of every private central banker for the last 2.5 centuries. And they love to play dirty.
It just seems like on a national level, it seems utterly hopeless to me. And I there's
disagree.
An extra, maybe a spiritual benefit of communities coming together and creating their own local currencies. I wish we'd talk about, Bitcoin never just smelled right to me, but aquaponics is an amazing new food technology, and that people can do in their own backyard or a little bit larger. And there are energy technologies coming out. What a difference it'll make if we really, really don't have to buy their oil anymore, and they can go back to,
Well, you're absolutely right. We live in a nation in which we are, if not coerced, we're encouraged to be dependent on these large corporations for our energy, for our water, for our food, for our pharmaceuticals. I mean, look how hard the medical industrial complex works to try and shut down natural cures, organic cures. They're pushing their latest patented molecule, sometimes with very deleterious effects to the patients who are taking it. I mean, look at a modern pharmaceutical ad on TV and that voice at the end, taking this drug could cause sudden death, your nose to fall off, your ears to grow 3 times as large, and people still truck off to the doctor and say, "Ooh, I saw this cool commercial about this wonderful drug. Give me a piece of paper so I can buy it." And it is all driven by the money junkies. But contrary to what you were saying before, I don't see the situation as hopeless. I'm seeing more and more Americans.
On a national level.
I'm saying even on the national level, more and more Americans they're turning their back on vaccinations. They're starting to grow their own food. They're starting to develop their own independence. To live off the grid, to disconnect. More and more people are taking all their money out of the bank except what they need to cover their outstanding checks, and they're keeping it under their control. This is the beginning of a huge evolution, and I don't think there's really any way to stop it. We got to take a break for some commercials. Kevin, we're going to let you go here. Back with more phone calls after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And a reminder to all of our listeners out there that the Republic Broadcasting Network is now up and available on the XDS satellite system. This is a system that allows our programming to reach AM and FM radio stations all across the country. So if you would like to break free of your tablet or iPad or computer and listen to our programming as you go about your daily business, please feel free to contact your local talk radio stations and suggest they go to republicbroadcasting.org. There's an affiliates relations link up at the very top where they can get the information on how to carry our programming. They don't even have to pay for it. It's an ad-sharing deal, and they can get the content and help us spread the word. Because in the wake of all these scandals, NSA Gate, IRS Gate, Benghazi Gate, Americans are starting to ask the important questions of the day, and they're not going to get the answers over on the corporate media. The corporate media is still going on and on about the Pope is down in Brazil, huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. So we need to get the word out so that Americans looking for those important answers can find the information they need to make good choices, because that's what Thomas Jefferson said was the highest duty of any American citizen to keep themselves fully informed so they could make good choices. We're going to go back to the phones here. Scott in Wisconsin. Aloha, Scott. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, how you doing, Mike? I wanted you to hear me out. I like you. You're looking better on the old TV there. Hey, Mike, we're both in agreement of what we're talking about with this. Just hear me out. The central, but with the central banking system, we talked about going into these other countries and mowing them down, saying, hey, you don't take our central bank in here. We're going to come in with our military. You know, Mike, I struggle every day with the worldview, and I am a man of hope like you. But I wanted you to comment on this if you could. I do follow the prophecy a little bit in the Scripture, and I'm not going to preach to you. But John's vision was at the end days of the financial system that I see is that everybody would have to take the mark of the beast to buy or sell. My question to you is, brother, do you see these guys collapsing the world and going to an FRID chip, which John said be planted in the right hand or in the forehead, to be able to purchase at the grocery store, purchase, you know what I mean, to beep it, to get the product, like if you go in right now to buy a package in the grocery store, you have to beep the UPC seal. So I wanted you to see if you could comment on that. Do you think possibly they are going to bankrupt the world and not go with a new currency, but go with what John spoke in Revelation of the mark of the beast, the RFI chip and that? So I just wanted to see what you would say and see if you got some other callers that would call in and rise the Michael Rivero show today. Thanks, brother, and have a good weekend.
Well, John's revelations, certainly with the mark of the beast, it's a metaphor. It wasn't meant to be taken literally. And you need to understand that back when the Bible, the New Testament at least, well, all of these documents were being written, they were a primary system of control over society, and that members of that society were by and large pretty much uneducated. There was almost zero literacy among the laity. They certainly had no science training or anything like that. So in order for religious rule to try and communicate ideas, it was always couched in terms of the angels want this, the devils want this. Now, virtually every ancient religion, including Christianity, forbade usury, the loaning of money at interest. And they didn't do that because some Cephalum came down on a cloud and said, you know, you shouldn't do this according to the imaginary playmate in the sky. But these authors of these works had seen how this practice of usury had destroyed entire civilizations, including Rome itself, as it began to fall apart. And that was why Islam was founded with usury being forbidden, and so was early Christianity. And they stuck to that rule up until the time of the Templars, who were able to basically circumvent the Pope and the prohibition by calling it renting of the money. And it didn't take the Templars very long to plunge all of Europe into unpayable debt, the same exact way the Federal Reserve System is doing today and the European Central Bank is doing today, until finally King Philip the Fair was left with no choice but to go out and kill the bankers. Now, I actually have a Templar in my family tree, which I used to take a great deal of pride in until I really studied what they were doing to the economics of Europe. And now I've sort of changed my mind and come back to realizing that the Templars didn't get half the kicking around they deserved on that situation. So John's revelation about the mark of the beast, it's a metaphor. It could even apply to the Federal Reserve note right now, where you must have that particular piece of ink and paper to carry out commerce here in the United States of America. We've already seen the U.S. Treasury Department try and crush down any other currencies, community currencies, the Liberty Dollar, all of that stuff, so that you are left with no choice but to be dependent on the Federal Reserve note for your day-to-day living. And certainly part of independence is the freedom to set up your own honest monetary system. And Ben Franklin wrote at the time of the Revolution, the refusal by King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system was a major contributor to that American Revolution. And we seem to be back in the same situation here again today. All righty then. Scott, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go here. Getting over to the war zone, there's been another major bombing in Damascus, 10 killed, 66 injured. The U.S. and Israel and its allies are still trying to find some way that they can revive what is clearly a failed plan to stage a covert coup and claim it is a popular revolution. They were trying to hijack the concept of the Arab Spring. And now they're back to resorting to terror attacks to try and get their way. Meanwhile, a little bit of an embarrassment coming out. This is from IntifadaPalestine.com. And it turns out that all of those Syrian police who joined the Free Syria Army, 95% of whom are not actually Syrian, were paid by the U.S. government to desert Assad and join the so-called rebels. They were just more mercenaries. The U.S. government went in and said, quit your job as a police officer, go over here and join the rebels, and we will pay you zigableams of dollars here. So it's just another indicator. This is all U.S. sponsored. It was part of that plan revealed by General Wesley Clark to conquer all of the oil-rich areas of the Middle East and force them back onto the petrodollar deal. You will only sell your oil for U.S. dollars, so the U.S. economy is able to prop itself up on other people's natural resources. That's one of the main agendas behind all these wars. The petrodollar deal was falling apart, and without petrodollar, what remains of Bretton Woods falls apart. And so this is literally a grab for the resource-rich areas of the world to not take those resources for the United States, but to make sure those resources are only sold for the U.S. dollar, so the U.S. dollar can profit on other people's natural resources. We saw that in Iraq. 2002, Saddam Hussein gets permission from the United Nations to sell Iraq's oil for euros under the Food for Oil program. 1 year later, the United States invades. They lynch Saddam Hussein. Iraq's oil is back on the world market, but only for sale for U.S. dollars. Same thing with Muammar Gaddafi down in Libya. 3 years ago, he was everybody's buddy, no longer a terrorist, recognized Israel's right to exist, was building these amazing civil engineering works to green Libya up. Then he announces that Libya is going to operate with a state central bank and a value-based currency, the gold dinar, which is a public currency operated as a public utility. And if you wanted to buy Libya's oil, you would pay for it only with gold dinars. U.S. invades, they kill Gaddafi. Libya has a brand new private central bank issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, and Libya's oil is back on sale only for U.S. dollars. That's basically what it's all about. That's why our sons and daughters are being asked to risk life and limb to go on out there. There's no war on terror. There's war on nations who want to sell their own natural resources for their currencies of choice, rather than being forced to be dependent on the U.S. dollar, the U.S. Federal Reserve note. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, bracing for more and more protests, the new incoming military government has charged Morsi with murder to justify his arrest, and the people of Egypt are definitely not happy with developments there. Going to take a break for news and station identification. We'll be right back with our number 2. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And apparently the mayor of San Diego, who's been accused of sexual harassment by 7 women, is responding by taking 2 weeks off from his job to go into a counseling program on how not to be harassing. And coming on the heels of Andrew Weiner's new embarrassment, and I feel really sorry for his wife. She's trying to stand by him during this whole thing. Is this really the best our political system can provide as leaders? And I'll be the first one to admit that American women have become hypersensitized to sexual flirtation by the militant feminist movement. And it's not a universal attitude. I remember many years ago, back in the 1980s, I was working on some film projects in Europe, in Italy and in Germany, and the attitude over there, if you didn't flirt with the women, you weren't going to get a lot of stuff done because, papers would get lost and stuff. They thought there was something wrong if you weren't flirting with them. In the United States, of course, it's very much, different. You can't say a woman is beautiful. You can't admire her clothing or anything like that, or it's all sexual harassment here, because we may be showering white-hot flaming death on innocent people around the world, but we're going to be very careful how we approach the female to prove that we are a just and moral people. Now, getting over to Tunisia, as expected, protests and riots have erupted after the opposition leader Sidi Bouzid, the city of Sidi Bouzid, after the assassination of the opposition leader Mohamed Brahmi. We talked about that yesterday, and this is only 6 months after another of the opposition leaders was gunned down. So a lot of wet work going on over there. Now, I have been talking in recent weeks about how all this revelation of spying on law-abiding Americans betrays a federal government that is absolutely paranoid. We know that Obama is paranoid, more so than Richard Nixon was. He's resorting to the same tactics Nixon did, like IRS targeting of donors to his opponents, IRS harassment of Occupy groups and Tea Party groups. And remember, misuse of the IRS was one of the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon, and it should be an article of impeachment against Barack Obama. But the government is truly afraid of the American people. They're getting paranoid. And apparently the Pentagon is now going to deploy huge blimps over Washington, D.C. to maintain 360-degree surveillance. It's a little bit of overkill when you realize that Washington, D.C. is some of the most heavily protected airspace on the planet. Of course, that protection was all ordered to stand down on 9/11 so that airplane could slam into the Pentagon, right into the accounting offices, where they were trying to find out just where that $3 trillion went missing that Donald Rumsfeld had announced to the press just the day before. Should have been the financial scandal of the decade, but lucky for Donald Rumsfeld and whoever got that $3 trillion, the next day 9/11 events just completely wiped it off the slate for the corporate media. But they're going to be putting up these giant blimps. So for those of you in Washington, D.C. with a crossbow, got a new target to practice on. Meanwhile, more abuse over from the TSA, which out here in Hawaii we have concluded means the Tourism Suppression Agency, because tourism in the Hawaiian Islands has definitely gone into a major decline. People don't want to be treated like prisoners of war, trying to come in here and go out of here to have a relaxing time. And apparently now the TSA, without warrants, without probable cause, are going to the valet parking lots and telling the valets to take the keys you trusted the valets with and open up the cars for inspection. We're seeing this article over here at Refreshing News 99 saying it could be a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. What do you mean could? It is a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. The government has no authority to peek into your private lives, your possessions, your home, your car, your phone, your computer, without probable cause. A crime is underway, supported by oath or affirmation, meaning there's got to be a witness saying that guy has got illegally counterfeit Beanie Babies in the trunk of his car. Then you've got probable cause, at which point you go to a judge and you get a warrant saying, I need to look in the trunk of this car. I think they've got counterfeit Beanie Babies. And then and only then can they look in the car. Anything else is unconstitutional, illegal, and the hallmark of an illegitimate tyrannical government. It's called the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Suggestions. And you'd better use it or you're going to lose it. This government clearly wants to break free of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We saw those trial articles a couple of months ago in New York Times and MSNBC. Oh, we should get rid of the Constitution. The federal government would be far more efficient without all those rules and restrictions to protect people. Who needs that stuff anymore? Well, I'll tell you this. If the federal government wants to drop the Constitution in the shredder, let them. Go ahead, shred it. You know why? Because the authority of the federal government rests on that Constitution. No Constitution, no federal government. The government can't claim to be the government if it has gone off that Constitution. That is the original contract with America. And the rules are simple. You play by the rules, or you have the decency to resign, or in Obama's case, abdicate. Meanwhile, speaking of constitutional violations, there's a story that's making its way around the independent media. Apparently, up in Scotia, the police, using an undercover informant, attempted to plant drugs on a small black-owned business to bust them for drug dealing, and they got caught on the store's own security camera. So anybody who believes all these TV shows and movies about what great Joes the police department are, it isn't true. They got this guy, undercover police informant, putting the drugs in the store, then to take a picture and go out and say he's dealing crack cocaine. We see this happening time and time again. Now, not too long ago, you probably remember, there was a guy named Joseph Lozito who took it upon himself to stop a knife attack that came at the end of a 28-hour city-killing spree. And this guy, ordinary citizens, stopped this guy on a subway train while the New York Police Department officers hid in the motorman's compartment. So Joseph Lozito sued the New York Police Department, saying that your police officers were there and did nothing to stop this guy. And I got injured getting him on the ground. The judge threw the case out of court, saying that police do not have a specific obligation of intervening to protect citizens in the case of violent crimes. And this is not the first time we've heard this. There was this horrible case in Georgetown, Washington, 3 women sharing a townhouse. Intruders broke in. They grabbed one of the women downstairs and started raping her. The 2 women upstairs called 911, and they were told, police are coming, police are coming, police are coming. 20 minutes later, the ruckus downstairs stopped. They figured either the police were there or the attackers had left. They walked downstairs right into the arms of these attackers, who proceeded to spend the entire night having them do all kinds of sexual theater before the attackers left the next morning, and the police had never arrived. So these 3 women sued Washington, D.C., and it was thrown out of court with the excuse that police do not actually have a legal obligation to intervene to save Americans from violent crimes. Their job is apparently handing out gratuitous traffic tickets to build revenues for the city coffers. And so this idea that we should surrender our firearms and rely on the police to protect us from violent crime is nonsense. Average wait time for a 911 call in this country is running something like 19 minutes. It's over an hour in Detroit. In the case of this Georgetown situation, it was never. And so this idea that you don't have a right to self-defense, wait for the police, is complete nonsense. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And the corporate media is still going on and on about the mayor of San Diego and sexual harassment and stuff. And they're just desperate to not have to report on Benghazi, IRS targeting of political opponents of the president, the NSA spying on every single living, law-abiding American without probable cause, and certainly in violation of the Constitution. We're going to give you sex scandals. We're going to give you Wiener's Wiener and the mayor of San Diego. And then they'll be off waxing rhapsodic about the royal baby. And what will the new baby's name be? Probably going to be something like Hey Kid. Now, we all know that one of the icons to rulership that comes with the Oval Office is the presidential library, in which the legacy of a president is enshrined for future generations to admire. And, of course, it is certainly telling the story of the administration from a very biased and focused point of view. And so now we're seeing this report coming out of the Bush Presidential Library. Somebody went through and noticed that on at least 8 separate cases, the library has displays, audio playback, video that sells the idea Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which we know he didn't. He had gotten rid of all the chemical and biological weapons the U.S. had given him to use on Iran. Iraq was fully in compliance with the Security Council resolution from the United Nations. There were no nuclear weapons or even materials related to nuclear weapons. It was a lie to sell you on this war. And the real reason for the war was, starting in 2002, Iraq was selling its oil for the euro instead of the dollar. And it was a threat to this petrodollar lock the United States has enjoyed on the world's resource-rich areas. It's all war for greed, war for the bankers. And it should be a reminder that historians should really stay out of those presidential libraries because they are not resources to find out what's really going on. It's basically a permanent shrine to the propaganda of what a swell Joe this or that particular president was here. Now then, there's a very bizarre story floating around here, and it has to do with a branch of the U.S. Commerce Department, which was aware that a couple of the computers in their facility were compromised by malware. Now, malware is a very generic term which covers everything from, well, what the NSA is doing to your computers down to malware that simply pops up Viagra ads into your email boxes. And apparently, they had nobody over at this branch of the U.S. Commerce Department who could download any of the free malware removers, and they wound up destroying $8 million worth of computers, keyboards, mice, everything. The attitude was, oh, it's the only way we can get the malware out of there. IT experts are looking at that and saying you could have gotten rid of that malware in one afternoon using free tools at zero cost to the taxpayer. And apparently this became a scandal when the Commerce Department asked for an additional $26 million so they could complete the process of brand new computers for everybody. And it underscores something I've been saying all along regarding the quality of people that are getting these very highly paid jobs in government. Because remember, your average government worker is making 30% more than somebody in the private sector doing exactly the same job. They're just living it up over there. The problem here is the U.S. government, in their paranoia, is afraid of people who can actually think. Because people who think ask questions about what they're being told to do. And that is a problem right now for a government engaged in clearly unconstitutional activity. We've already documented how police forces across America and the TSA, and probably other agencies as well, when you apply for work there, you're given an IQ test, and if you score too high, you are rejected as a potential employee. They don't want intelligent thinking people in these positions because they're going to start questioning what's going on. So as a result, your average federal government worker is an obedient moron who will follow instructions and inevitably sees the only solution to every problem they encounter as spending oodles and oodles of taxpayer money, because they're incapable of seeing intelligent and creative ways to solve problems at low cost. Of course, when you have a fire hose of taxpayer dollars available to yourself, everything looks like a forest fire here. Now, speaking of computers, very alarming story, especially coming so quickly after the apparent assassination of reporter Michael Hastings. There is a programmer, a black hat programmer, actually he's a security consultant. He's not engaged in actual crime, but he goes out and he tries to find weaknesses in computer systems. Guy by the name of Barnaby Jack, and he was scheduled to speak at next week's Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas about an exploit he had discovered that would allow a hacker to break into and interfere with the operation of implanted pacemakers, which communicate wirelessly, so that the status of your heart and how often it had to go off can be read by the doctor without surgical intervention, which sounds like a really good idea. But Barnaby Jack had discovered that it was possible to remotely access the pacemaker and kill whoever was wearing it. And today, Barnaby Jack died. Guy's in his 30s. The San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office is refusing to release details of just how he died. Said, yes, he's dead. You don't need to know how. Now, a couple of things you need to keep in mind. First of all, the NSA is hand in glove with these black hat security experts. In fact, the head of the NSA is going to be the keynote speaker at their conference next week. Now, Barnaby Jack was reportedly working with the manufacturer of this pacemaker in question, very common unit, in order to improve security, to block remote tinkering and tampering. Now, my next question is, how many U.S. politicians and officials are wearing those pacemakers that could be remotely hacked to assassinate them in the middle of a crowded room surrounded by their armed security? Oh, my goodness, he just had a heart attack. Gee, shuckies, how could that happen? He had a pacemaker. And would the NSA want the pacemaker company to know how it's being done and to provide protection against that kind of assassination by remote control? It reminds me very much of the film version of Frank Herbert's Dune, in which the evil Baron Harkonnen has everybody in his close immediate circle fitted with a plug right into their heart with a little ring on it, which you can just reach and yank the ring and they bleed to death in seconds in front of him. That's basically what we're looking at. People with a pacemaker can be told, look, do what you're being told to do, or you're going to die in the middle of church next week. So we'll keep an eye on that story and find out what this guy died of. But we're seeing a lot of wet work take place in this country. We have to be on guard right now. Still in the context of computers, we're hearing more and more people complaining about Great Britain's new plan for automatic content filtering on their internet inside Great Britain. Now, the overt explanation is we must be fighting child porn. Well, if you want to fight child porn, why don't you go to all those intelligence agencies who are making this stuff in order to plant on computers being used by activists and critics of the government? That's because that's where it's all coming from, I think. But these experts looking at Great Britain's new plan are saying that these filters they're setting up are going to filter all kinds of stuff, including activists and dissenters' websites, alternative health websites. You are by default filtered. You have to go to the government of Great Britain and explain why your website should not be filtered, which amounts to a covert licensing of web content. Only websites the government approves of will be visible to your browser. Not going to work. People will find ways around it. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show here, looking at the American stock market. The plunge protection team is massaging that market as hard as they can, trying to get to that Friday happy ending. As is usual, Weiner is out there making speeches saying the majority of New York voters want to focus on the issues, not on my personal behavior. Not according to the latest polls. He used to have the lead. Now he's down there in the Al-Qaeda. And we need to remember, when we talk about the character of people and the character of our leaders. Character is how you're behaving when you don't think anybody is watching. When you're up there on TV at a press conference or doing your show, you can act however you want to act to sell whatever image of yourself you want to the voters. But the real measure of the character of our leadership is how they behave in private. And whether it's Weiner or this mayor in San Diego, it seems we have a political system that is very, very attractive to people completely lacking in any sense of morality whatsoever. We keep looking at people like this and asking, is this really the best the American system can produce, or are these merely the losers who succeeded in finding their way through the filters imposed on the election system by corporate and foreign government interests to make sure that only approved candidates appear on that ballot by the time we, the American people, actually step into a voting booth. Getting back to the issue about computers, a very interesting story coming out of the Los Angeles Unified School District. They are issuing taxpayer-funded iPads to each of their 640,000 children at a time when even Los Angeles is having trouble making ends meet. I wonder where the funding came from. And if you are in Los Angeles and you are a parent of one of these children, or if you're one of the kids, the first piece of advice I want to give you is get some masking tape and put it over those little built-in cameras on the iPad. Because remember, we already had that one scandal where a school district was caught using the built-in cameras on school-supplied laptops to watch kids in their bedrooms. We know what kids like to do in their bedrooms when they don't think anybody is watching or listening. And obviously the potential for abuse here cannot be ignored, especially in a nation where it's now just sort of open season on Americans by anybody who sees themselves as aligned with the government. And I also question the issuance of iPads for another reason. Not the iPad itself. It's a very nicely built product. And it's very, very useful. But again, it is selling this model of just having a portable electronic device that is merely a terminal into your data and files and software that is stored on a large central server someplace out of your control. And I think if we want to be independent, we have to be independent of the internet and the cloud. That's why so many people were kicking up a fuss that one of the latest video players won't even operate unless you're plugged into the internet, where it can be sending information on you back to the central storage facility. Path to independence means going back to standalone desktop computers. Your data is on your local hard drive. You can unplug that Ethernet cable from the wall and still do most of what you need to do to function your business. The Russian government is scrapping computers entirely and going back to manual typewriters for all their classified documents. I miss my old Swintech. And a final reminder of online. This is a story we've reported on before, but it's being reported again on the Council for the National Interest. The government of Israel pays Israeli students in this country to go online and post Israeli state propaganda on websites like Facebook. They have a little communication system called Megaphone. It's always on their desktop. Anytime any of these hired propaganda shills for Israel see anyone being critical of Israel, they'll send a little notice on their little Megaphone window. It pops up on all the other propagandists' window, and they all know to pile on in and say, oh, you're a Jew hater, you're an anti-Semite. You can't criticize Israel. Israel's above reproach. Wrong. Somebody just sent a story in here about in order to sell the idea that drones are our friends, we're seeing all these stories about how drones are going to be used to deliver pizzas, drones are going to be used to deliver beer, drones are going to be used to deliver dry cleaning. Oh, the drones are your friend. Don't worry about them. And just because it's peeking in your bedroom window at your wife when she's undressing, don't get upset or you won't get your pizza on time. They're trying to condition you to the idea that when you see a drone over your head, it's probably just up there supporting commerce. And it's incredibly reckless and incredibly dangerous because there's no control of where they're going. Everybody's an individual operator. And I'll tell you right now, it's just going to take one of these drones suffering a malfunction and falling out of the sky and hitting some innocent bystander, and that whole party's going to be over. And the only reason they're pushing it, because it's expensive to own and operate a drone. There's no financial gain using a drone to deliver pizza as opposed to some minimum wage college kid driving their car around. It's not cost effective, and it's prone to problems. We know these drones suffer high rates of failure. They're not designed for long endurance or durability. You use it to peek on somebody, you put it back in the case, and then you bring it out again. They're not designed to be flying constant amounts of time. And the only reason they're pushing this idea is to sell the idea that a drone over your head is not a threat to the American people. Yes, it is. They break down. They fall out of the sky. They hit property. They hit people. We've already had a couple of near misses between these drones and commercial and civil aviation. But they're trying to sell you the drone is your friend. Send in the drones. There have to be drones. We're going to go back to the phones here. Glenn in Philadelphia. Aloha. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. I just wanted to touch base on the pacemaker thing. I doubt that many politicos really have pacemakers. They're used primarily for electrical dysrhythmias, slow rhythms called bradycardias, and a few other things. I mean, if you look at plumbing versus electrical, there's far more heart diseases related to coronary artery disease and stuff like that. I'm sure politicos, with all the drinking and drugs and sexually transmitted diseases, have their share of health problems, but most of them probably aren't candidates for pacemakers. Cheney was a special case because when they opened him up to try and attach the pacemaker, there was nothing there to which to attach it.
Well, I'm not sure that that's a supportable claim that members of the political class are somehow less likely to need pacemakers. For one thing, because of their much higher economic status, they're more likely to get one on the recommendation of a doctor because they can afford to do it. Whereas the class of people you're talking about that need them very often won't get one because they can't afford it. Their insurance won't cover it. Problem's probably going to be a lot worse under Obamacare. But setting pacemakers aside, if it's possible to interfere with implanted medical equipment in this one case, then we must presume the possibility to interfere remotely with implanted medical equipment that may not be a pacemaker. There are other kinds of implanted systems of control that are put into people. And
well, yeah, no, I just meant, well, dysrhythmias are common, branch blocks and stuff like delays. A lot of dysrhythmias can be treated medically. The actual prevalence of bradycardia is requiring a pacemaker, or dysrhythmias requiring a pacemaker isn't there per capita. There just aren't that many of them out there anywhere.
Well, you seem to be making a lot of assumptions about what's going on here, and the bottom line is, let's go and find out. I'm going to make it a point to go out over the weekend and do some research and see if I can find out just how many of our judges, appointed officials, elected officials, heads of committee, senators, representatives. I know the president doesn't have one, I don't think. There was even some talk.
I'm sure
there
a lot
was
of them
even
have coronary artery disease and plaques and high cholesterol and stuff like that. But when you look at the distribution of heart disease overall.
Glenn, you're assuming here, and we know what assume means. So I'm going to go out and do the research and try and find out here. Because, and let's even get out of politics. What about business leaders, business owners? Hey, you're selling a brand new encryption system, and you've been telling us you don't want to backdoor it for the NSA. If you put the backdoor in, or your Aunt Sadie is going to suffer a mysterious heart attack in the middle of church. I mean, the potential misuse for this capability is there. And we shouldn't just write off and say, oh, they would never do something like that. Of course they would. They're the NSA. Anyway, over in Germany, here's a positive sign. Bank executives are now being charged and going on trial for breach of fiduciary trust. We need more of that here in the United States. Going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about how Germany is now starting to prosecute their bankers for fiduciary irresponsibility. And what they're saying is, even though we cannot prove you actually committed a crime, your actions and decisions harmed your depositors, your investors, and the economy as a whole, and we're going to throw you in jail anyway, following the Iceland model. Now, we have been talking about the abuses of the payday lenders. It's true vulture capitalism. It's legalized loan sharking. And one of the worst abusers is Wonga. And as it turns out, apparently, Wonga is at least partly owned by the Church of England. Talk about abandoning the prohibition against usury that used to be a hallmark of early Christianity. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is having to make a public statement about, well, maybe we should rethink that one, where we're putting our investment money. My. Over in Russia, for you aviation enthusiasts, and I know there's a lot of you out there, the world's largest transport aircraft, the Ruslan, was built back in 1982, and it is the record holder in terms of capacity for a serially manufactured aircraft. There's some custom, one-of-a-kind aircraft that actually exceed that. But it's the Antonov 124, and it's an amazing aircraft, and now it looks like Russia, the production was shut down with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia is going to start rebuilding that aircraft, and it is an amazing aircraft. I saw it on a documentary not too long ago. And it's a very superior aircraft as opposed to some American models. I think it's the C-5. If it's actually empty, they have to load a concrete block on it to keep it stable. Meanwhile, getting back to the Gulf oil disaster now, this most recent blowout appears to be under control, not because of anything the U.S. government was able to do, but apparently the pit out of which all this natural gas was pouring caved in on itself, and they're hoping there's enough silt to sort of hold things in control. I wouldn't want to bet the health and safety of the seafood in the Gulf on that, and so far nobody's actually shown us any videos from underwater remotely operated vehicles to guarantee that there isn't still seepage and bubbles coming out of there like we saw at Deepwater Horizon. But getting back to Deepwater Horizon, it turns out Halliburton Energy Services, who was one of the contractors to British Petroleum during that whole Deepwater Horizon disaster, has now admitted to destroying evidence regarding what happened back then. And they're being hit with a fine of $200,000, which sounds like a lot to you and I, and it is, but to Halliburton, it is basically 0.0007 of 1% of their total revenues. It's a wrist slap. It's not even a wrist slap. It's one finger against the wrist for destroying evidence as to exactly what the cause of this disaster was that killed 11 rig workers and caused the largest oil spill in U.S. history, intoxified the Gulf. And these companies just get off scot-free. We already know part of what the problem was. The United States, almost alone among oil-producing nations, does not mandate acoustic blowout preventers on the seafloor to prevent these giant gas bubbles from building up momentum that can lead to these blowouts at the top of the well. And the manual blowout preventer that was on the underneath the Deepwater Horizon was 4 years overdue for its regular maintenance. And we're talking a piece of equipment under serious ocean pressure, corrosion from the salt water, corrosion from the oil and gas inside. It is something that has to be maintained regularly to work. And apparently it did not work correctly at the time. And as more and more debris jammed up into the blowout preventer, it failed to shut off. And now we're finding out that Halliburton is now admitting, yeah, they got rid of the detailed information about what happened, which means whatever happened was going to cost them more than the $200,000 fine they paid for destroying evidence. Now, let's see, moving right along. Only 15% of farmers would actually eat GMO food. We know that at the Monsanto's own cafeteria and Parliament and the White House, they do not serve GMO food at all. What do they know that we're not supposed to know? Huge, huge problem. Monsanto's patent appeal rejected by the Indian government. And apparently India just on a whole ruled against Monsanto and GMO. This is a very dangerous technology. It's a very dangerous technology, and it's been rushed to market without adequate testing. And the problem in terms of the health of anybody consuming these products, it's not just the altered DNA, which is itself destroyed with adequate cooking. It is the fact that during the growth of this organism, the DNA is altering the way proteins are synthesized in that organism. And those proteins are going to be different from what you are used to eating. And over time, they can produce, at the very least, highly allergic reactions as your body starts to digest that protein and say, wait a minute, this isn't what it's supposed to be. We know there have already been studies, carefully done studies, showing serious health consequences from consumption of GMO corn and the glyphosate weed killers that are poured all over them. And the industry, because of its political clout, so far has been able to hide that from the American public. They literally got the government of France, in which this study I'm talking about was done, to simply say, we understand you got these results, we reject them. Didn't refute them, merely said, we're not going to look. It's contrary to our long-term economic outlook. Meanwhile, the Environmental Protection Agency, the same Environmental Protection Agency that told all those New York first responders that it was okay to go down and breathe that asbestos-laden air in the aftermath of 9/11, that EPA, has now increased the limit that your food can be contaminated with glyphosate by 3,000%. They set these limits not to serve the public health interest, but to basically convince you that what you're being given is safe. We saw that during the melanin scandal, the synthetic plastic protein that was being put in dog food and even baby food. And it was first exposed when China was doing it, and there were unexplained deaths of pets being fed this food. And there was a big, huge China bash. Oh, they're putting this melanin in their products. And then it came out American companies are doing exactly the same thing. And the EPA revised upward its maximum limit for exposure to melanin to just above what the American companies were using and just below what the Chinese companies were using. So it's all politically driven. It's not driven by science. It's not driven by concern for public health. It's driven by the interests of businesses. Our melanin-laced food is good, and their melanin-laced food is bad. This story kind of annoyed me because even though I never used livestock, I used to be a professional magician. It's how I paid for my college education. And apparently, Marty the Magician got a letter from the United States government. And it began with the words, "Dear members of our regulated community." And apparently the USDA wanted a written disaster plan on how Marty the Magician was going to save his bunny rabbit in the event of a disaster. Boy, I'm glad to live in a country where everything is so great that the government is going to worry about disaster plans for the rabbits that magicians are using. This is just somebody justifying their paycheck. Some nephew of some elected official who got a job at the USDA and is sitting in an office saying, "What am I going to do? Just my paycheck." Oh, I don't know. Magicians use rabbits. We can regulate the rabbits. We can mandate a disaster plan. Talk about gratuitous and pointless. Now, for the record, with rare exception, magicians I've known who used livestock treat them very, very well. Probably a lot better than most people treat their pets because that's part of their business. And they don't want the audience to see a maltreated animal. Going to take a break for news, station identification. We'll be back with the lovely Lady Claire after these words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show today. And looking at the corporate media, Obama is back out there saying that all these scandals are phony. This NSA spying and the IRS targeting police, it's all just phony stuff. And the longer you pay attention to them, the worse the economy is going to get. Well, the economy is going downhill anyway. They can't stop it. And Obama is just grasping at straws to try and rebuild his image now that all of this horrible stuff is coming out there. Of course, if he really wanted to improve his image, he could shut down Guantanamo. He could pull the plug on the NSA. He does have the authority as president to do all that stuff. But he did a lot of bad things, and now it's all coming out here. And he's thrashing around trying to find anything that he can use as a distraction. Speaking of distractions,
yes.
For those of you watching on BAM User TV here, the lovely creature sitting behind me is the Lady Claire, who joins us every Friday in our third hour to offer her unique perspective on what's going on. And I think you're going to be talking about the next distraction staged by the United States government to take us mind off all those phony scandals.
Yes, yes. It does feel, and I know, Michael, you've been talking about this earlier this week, it does feel as though we are absolutely being conditized or distracted from what some of the bigger issues are. All of the gates coming up, as you mentioned, and it appears that the U.S. military is planning direct intervention in Syria to topple al-Assad. Well, in reading this, and also in reading Martin Dempsey's spelling out of what this is going to cost for an absolutely broke government that doesn't have the money, I had an industrial strength palm to forehead moment in reading it. And unfortunately, just because a military move against Syria would be the most pig-headedly, ham-fistedly wrong thing the U.S. government could do, is no guarantee that they won't do it. And
pig-headed and ham-fisted, that's national policy right now.
Yep.
The reality is this attempt at a covert overthrow masquerading as a popular revolution. And by the way, for those of you wondering what that strange noise in the background is, we live right next to a golf course, and they've got this big mowing machine out there churning things up. So that's what all that racket was all about. The reality is this hired mercenary army, this covert attempt at a coup d'etat has absolutely cratered. And but Syria is indispensable both for the petrodollar agenda, the forcing of the world back onto Bretton Woods, and certainly it's the final stepping stone for the long-lusted for war with Iran. If the United States loses in Syria and Assad retaking control of Syria will be seen as a U.S. loss, even though it was a covert war. that is definitely going to dampen ardor and enthusiasm for yet another potentially failing operation inside Iran, especially with Russia very clearly coming in on the opposite side.
And I would definitely like to respectfully remind those precious few adults in the room in the bowels of power, in the State Department, Pentagon, White House, etc., that at this point in its history, the U.S. government does not have the troop strength, the manufacturing, or the money to ensure a positive outcome with a conventional war. And this is why this gets so dangerous, because in recognizing that they're not winning, such a war could go nuclear in a heartbeat. And that's going to be bad news for anyone who doesn't have
2 million sunblocks.
Yes, something like that.
Well, the issue here is, again, going back to the original war plan that was leaked out by General Wesley Clark, all of these conquests were planned to be over by 2008. Was supposed to be a done deal. Here we are in 2013, and the war agenda is clearly falling apart. And so we're already, all these years, past what they planned to have to throw at the war. I have absolutely no doubt that as they move forward, the U.S. will be considering the use of nuclear weapons in a first strike capability. We ended World War II with nuclear weapons. They're going to escalate World War III with nuclear weapons. We know those deep crust bunker busters that are going to be aimed at Iran's nuclear power infrastructure are nuclear tipped. We already know that Israel is arming their Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. And for these world conquerors aware that they can't win a prolonged conventional ground war, going nuclear might be seen as their final option, because they can't quit. They've gone too far to turn around and say, we're sorry, we want to go back to status quo ante. They're seeing it really as an all-or-nothing deal, and all does include nuclear weapons.
Russia has been very clear, also China's been very clear, that they will not allow this to happen with Syria.
Okay, and what is next on your list of things to ruminate about?
Well, I wouldn't quite characterize it as ruminating, but there is a mass hunger strike by California prisoners at the Pelican Bay facility, and it's going into its third week. It is a big deal. You're not going to see any news about it on corporate television at all. It's 30,000 guys who are refusing to eat unless and until some very basic demands are met. But prison officials are not negotiating, and they're not doing anything in spite of the fact that these hunger strikes are definitely dangerous to the prisoners' health.
Well, what's going on here, of course, is the United States is one of the world leaders in per capita incarceration of their population. We have a higher percentage of our people in prison than any other industrialized nation. And the prisons are in many cases simply not being kept up, the ones that are operated by the government. These new private corporate-owned work farm prisons are not held to any kind of standards. They're overcrowded. They already have prisoners literally living in tents out in the prison exercise yard. They've taken cells that used to have 2 bunks and moved in there a freestanding floor rack of 3 more bunks. It's hideously overcrowded. It is unhealthy. And they just keep cramming more people in there for things like marijuana arrests, because these corporations that run these prisons make more money the more people go to jail. Remember, we had that scandal not too long ago where a judge got caught taking bribes from a prison corporation to send more prisoners to that prison so that they could make more money off the state budget. And so it's reached a point where the conditions are basically as bad, if not worse, than we see down in Guantanamo.
Absolutely. And one of the things prison officials are doing, they're putting all of these men who are protesting in solitary and pumping ice-cold air into those cells to try to get them to stop.
Well, by goodness, that would be considered torture if this was done to an enemy soldier in time of war. But of course it isn't. It's a U.S. citizen, so the government can do whatever they want. It's like what we saw down in Waco, where they gassed that church full of women and children to death with a poison gas that is illegal to use on enemy troops in time of war. But hey, these are American citizens, so we can just do whatever we want to them.
And what you're looking at here from a medical standpoint, Some of these guys are going to get critically ill and die as a result of this hunger strike. And it appears that the state of California is very busy hoping to hurry that along with some of the more outspoken hunger strikers. And
well, you need to remember, with that degree of crowding,
Yeah.
and the sanitation systems of those prisons are not built to handle that volume.
Right.
One highly contagious disease in there.
It's a slate wiper.
It'll just
Yep.
wipe the slate.
And with regard to the rest, I have to wonder if there have been some restraint chairs deployed like we have in Gitmo, and if forced NG tube feeding is going to be part of the way that officials in California are going to try to control this hunger strike. And the other thing about it that is very scary, absolutely no press has been allowed to talk to any of the striking prisoners. Not one person can get in there.
Well, what we need are for some of these lawyers who are, by law, allowed access to these prisoners. Some of these lawyers need to go public and make a big stink about it.
Yes.
Because if we allow the state of California to maltreat criminal prisoners this badly,
Yes.
and we allow the federal government to maltreat political prisoners that badly, then we allow them to treat us all that badly. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And Claire, what's your next topic?
Well, the next topic is apparently the U.S. government is at war with redacted. There is apparently a really long list of dangerous enemies threatening America, all of whom fit under the language of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, but of course that list is classified. In fact, it is so classified.
How classified is it?
A number of senators have pledged in recent months to update the 2001 AUMF, written to authorize the use of force against those who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. On the
except
grounds
that obviously we're attacking nations that had nothing to do with 9/11.
Yeah.
I mean, we even have George W. Bush on video admitting Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And as I understand, at least the original language of the authorization for the use of military force, it was contingent on two pieces of information. One, confirmation that Iraq was involved in 9/11, and confirmation that Iraq actually did have banned weapons of mass destruction, neither of which was true.
Right.
George W. Bush lied in his letter of transmittal to Congress in March, I think it was 13th, 2003, in which he said, yes, Iraq was involved in 9/11, they've got weapons of mass destruction, and then subsequently, we have that video clip of him saying Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. The problem I have with a classified list of targets is we can't preclude it's simply being changed on the fly. Who do we need to invade this week? All right, add them onto the list. Nobody's supposed to see it anyway. They won't know it's a recent addition, like Venezuela.
Yes.
Or now that they've found all that oil and gas down there,
Australia. Let's invade Australia. Why? Because it's there.
Because it's there. Good eye, a bunch of Muslims, terrorists down here in Australia. All right.
And it really annoys me because I know that the Bush administration loved this, and so does the Obama administration love this in its present form, because it's the perfect instrument for getting around the Constitution, which, as I understand it, states very emphatically and clearly that only Congress can declare war.
The good old days back in 2001, 2003, when there was at least the pretense of complying with the Constitution.
Yeah.
Unlike today, where the government's attitude is, Constitution, Smonstitution. We took it away, you can't have it back. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I think that intelligent people are going to sit back, figure out how to take care of themselves and their families, and calmly wait.
Get off the grid.
Yep.
Pull your money out of the bank. You should have no more money in the bank than you need to cover your outstanding checks. Remember what happened in Cyprus?
Yep, the haircut.
It was a scalping is what it was.
Yes.
And it's going to happen here. It's already written into the financial plans for Canada's next fiscal budget. They're already openly talking about it here. The idea is that these bankers have screwed up the economy, and as it falls apart, they're going to force you, the American people, who had nothing to do with any of this fraud, but you get to cover the losses. That is economic fascism.
Absolutely. The next thing I wanted to look at, because even we need a laugh, and I would imagine that some of our readers and listeners out there need a laugh. And I looked at this morning, and I did a double take. Did I really read what I thought that I had read? And yes, I had. The Homeland Security future home is a former mental hospital. unbelievable.
I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I love the smell of irony in the morning. And the establishment of the DHS was not about making Americans more safe, but about a delusional, terrified, and deranged government believing that it had to protect itself against the citizens it allegedly represents. I mean, that's what it's all about.
Now, there's another wrinkle to that. This former mental hospital that the Department of Homeland Security is now using as one of their dungeons was also involved very much in the Central Intelligence Agency's Operation MK Ultra, which they basically took over from the Nazis. That's where the acronym MK comes from. It was the initials of the German words for mind control.
Yeah.
And because we're America and we're better than the Nazis, it went from being MK to MK Ultra. And they were doing all kinds of serious experiments on American citizens, very often without their knowledge and awareness, and certainly without their permission. MK Ultra was literally running a series of sex rooms in San Francisco, staffed with prostitutes, equipped with all the fetish equipment you'd like. You know, explicit pictures on the wall, lots of booze, lots of drugs, to find the correct formula of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that would get people to spill their deepest, darkest secrets. It never worked, but it was a lot of fun, so it went on for 9 years until finally the CIA pulled the budget plug.
Yeah.
Boy, how do you put that on your resume?
Yeah.
9 years, ran a sex room for the Central Intelligence Agency, spent a lot of money, did a lot of drugs, did every kinky thing you can imagine.
And it didn't work.
It didn't work here. You know, who's going to hire you after that?
And, of course, one of the most concrete things that the U.S. government could do to assure that there is no terrorism against American assets overseas or here at home is to stop mucking about in other people's countries for resources to which it has absolutely no moral right.
Well, you don't understand. It's our manifest destiny to mess around with other people's countries, and if they don't like it, we have the right to kill them. Harump, harump, harump.
Yeah, that's
it's all driven by the fact that the U.S. economy is in serious trouble because it's based on this Ponzi scheme banking system that cannot prevail. Even John Maynard Keynes, who was the architect of modern banking, he's revered as a god by the money junkies on Wall Street because he, like Adam Smith, came up with a scholarly excuse for people to just be rotten, greedy bastards. And even Keynes himself said, yeah, it's not going to last forever. It's going to implode. But, hey, we're all going to be dead by then, so who cares?
Right.
Very, very damaging attitude there. And so every time this nation gets into a financial mess, they get out of it with a world war. Crash of 1907, get into World War I. Crash of 1929, get into World War II. Crash of 2008. Look how many nations the United States has already invaded on 2 continents. Under current U.S. military doctrine, a 2-front war on 2 continents is technically considered a world war. And something for you to keep in your mind as you go back and look at all wars are banker wars once more time. Before the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. They came in together because war is the banker's richest harvest. When you have this Ponzi scheme of lending the public currency as a loan at interest, you get the people into debt. When the people stop borrowing, then you have the government start to borrow on their behalf. That's where the Keynes economy comes in. The Keynesian economy comes in. When the government and people don't want to borrow anymore, that's when you kick off a war, because a war forces everybody to borrow, to fight the war, and borrow more to rebuild from the war. It's a horrible 3-step process, and at the end of it, ordinary people like you and I, we have pretty much what we had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger, and we're back in debt to the bankers for another 50 to 100 years. That's the scam.
Yep.
War is the bankers' richest harvest, and they're going for the gold on this one.
Absolutely.
Literally.
The other topic I'd like to take a look at today is what's been going on in Bahrain. And again, you were not seeing this on any of the corporate media that I've seen. Apparently, security forces there have been raiding dozens of homes every day since April, arresting young men and torturing them to force confessions to some crime. And their only crime is being...
Wait a minute. That's our trademarked behavior down at Guantanamo.
Yeah. Funny about that.
Torture Iraqis to death to find nuclear weapons that never existed. That's the American way. How dare those Bahrainis get in on our action?
And, you know, if any of the members of this administration had something approximating a conscience, the behavior of the Sunni Al-Khalifa monarchy against its Shiite population would be a migraine-inducing, disgusting embarrassment. Of course, conscience is something people running for high office have surgically removed, so no problem there. We know that Bahrain is home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet. So the Obama administration is just playing deaf, dumb, and blind to this escalating pattern of violence by the monarchy against its own people, whose only crime is for advocating for a constitutional monarchy.
Okay, we got to take another break for commercials. We got a caller waiting on the line. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to Claire here, we've got a caller waiting on the line, Fred in, I think it's Mississippi. Aloha, Fred. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind? I'm sorry, Michigan. Michigan. My mistake. I don't have my little list of abbreviations here anymore. What's on your mind today, Fred?
Yeah, Michigan, Mississippi, what's the difference, right?
A lot of mud.
Maybe 100,000 wild pigs roaming the landscape, maybe, I don't know.
Oh, we got a few of those out here. You can go out bow hunting and put some food in the freezer for, well, we don't really have a winter out here. We have two seasons, rainy and tourist.
Well, that's good to hear. Paradise is still paradise, eh?
What's on your mind?
Well, pursuant to your earlier call, the Marine fellow from the trenches.
Yes.
He was intimating that there would be some course of action for common people at the grassroots level to pursue. So, in recognizing the historic record of the origin of the international Talmudic Jewish banker cabal, that according to various writers and authors from Britain, such as the Bolshevik Revolution, this is actually a quote from the American.
Okay,
Hebrew.
Fred, pardon me for cutting you off, but you're kind of reaching way back to some really old history, and I think the From the Trenches phone call was basically about delinking from the grid today, and we see our government passing laws to ban alternative currencies, passing laws to basically try and shut down local organic farmers markets to force us back into dependency on food corporations, passing laws trying to shut down natural, herbal, alternative medical treatments in order to force us in dependency onto the pharmacy corporations. And that kind of enforced dependency is really the problem that we're all facing here. You will buy your food from this buddy of the government. You will buy your medicines from that buddy of the government. You will get your electricity from this other friend of the government, and you will store all your data on the servers of this other person by the government. And that kind of forced dependency is literally what led this nation to revolution before. And so if you want to do something that is nonviolent and non-cooperative, along the model of Gandhi, start basically pulling back, pull out of the grid, disconnect. Throw away all those shopper cards that they are using to track you with. Bring your money at home, put some of them into silver and gold. Go over to Republic Trading Group, because when you buy your silver and gold from them, it helps RBN. And we need to really kind of focus on what's going on here and now, because discussions about going back to all this history about it really is almost not relevant any longer. We're dealing with serious money junkyism, which isn't a religion. It is a psychological illness, and we need to recognize it as such. Okay? All right, so I guess that caller is now gone. I talked him to death. Must have been painful agony at the end. What is the next thing you want to talk about?
Well, I'd like to continue with Bahrain, because this is a really ugly blot on the morality of the United States as a country. And the Obama administration is playing deaf, dumb, and blind to this. And the people who have been protesting have been largely peaceful so far. But of course, a U.S. government which has institutionalized extrajudicial assassinations against its own citizens and others, drone strikes, torture, total surveillance of its own population, and indefinite detention of its citizens without due process, hardly has any high moral ground from which to lecture the Al-Khalifa monarchy on the treatment of its people.
Well, the other part of it, of course, is, Bahrain may be a violent, tyrannical, oppressive government, but they're buddy-buddy with our violent, tyrannical, oppressive government. Yeah. And it's this very obvious double standard where they're going to go into a country whose government is not friends with the United States and say, we must help these poor, struggling people against the evil regime. But if it's a government that's friendly with the United States is clearly on the side of repressing ordinary people and keeping the serfs in their slave pens. And that's what we're seeing in Bahrain. Yeah,
well, likes attract.
What's your next story?
This has to do with Central Asia and the neighbors around Azerbaijan are watching with a lot of concern because Azerbaijan has gone on a weapons buying spree recently. And it's an oil-rich company that can afford to spend on weaponry. And the president, Aliyev, has made the observation that all of the hardware he's purchased is not just for show. It was needed because of the unresolved conflict with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Oh, come on. This guy in Azerbaijan, we know what his problem is. He's got war envy. He's seeing the United States go out invading all these countries and says, I want to get involved. They're writing the future history here, and I want to be included in the appendix. So he's going to start war with Armenia to say, see, I'm a world-destroying despot just as much as anybody else.
And this is one of the most significant conflicts that most people here in the United States have heard little or nothing about. And I think that the international community has got to take Azerbaijan's threats pretty seriously and condemn the defense buying spree. It was seized by ethnic Armenian separatists in a war in the early 1990s, and it left more than 30,000 dead. And it's really at the heart of a long simmering tension between ex-Soviet neighbors, Azerbaijan and Armenia. And violence comes every so often. And I would just like to hope that the adults in the room in the bowels of power in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh will find a way to ratchet this tension down, because this has the possibility of blowing up into, beyond a regional dispute, into an international dispute.
Well, it's just going to fit into the already existing one. And again, if you go back and you look at the history of World War I and World War II, the world was already in conflict. Then there was an incident that captured the public mind and mood, where all of a sudden all these disparate little conflicts were seen as welded together into a global war, whether it was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The war was already ongoing. People just didn't realize the true scale of it. We're in the same situation now, and we may yet see another 9/11 designed to make everybody snap up and say, oh, yes, it's a world war. We're going to forgive the federal government for all these gates. We're going to forget all about private central banking. We're going to throw a snappy salute at the flag and fling our children onto the designated enemy's bayonets. I don't think it'll work, but I'm sure those Cold War fossils who are still in charge of U.S. foreign policy are thinking along those lines.
Right. And, Mike, should there be more conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over this region, do you think because Armenia is supported by Russia that the United States would take the side of Azerbaijan in this conflict?
They probably would, because the area that's in dispute, again, it's all about where the borders go relative to those oil deposits. That's what's really going on here.
Yeah. It could get nasty. I'm hoping it won't, but it could get very nasty very soon.
Unfortunately, nasty is the odds-on favorite right now at all those Las Vegas bookies. Do you have something else here?
I think that was it.
That was it. I'm going to turn down your microphone here. We're coming up on the top of the show. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Very interesting article just crossed my desk from the Telegraph over in Great Britain. The International Monetary Fund is afraid that if the Federal Reserve starts to taper the quantitative easing, it could reignite the euro debt crisis. And this is a very important thing to be looking at. We know that Wall Street, during the whole run-up about mortgage-backed securities, they got into the habit of selling what are called credit default swaps. These are like insurance policies against debt, but they're not regulated. And there are two ongoing abuses. One, you can buy a credit default swap against somebody else's investment. You don't have to own the asset like you do with regular conventional insurance. And the other part of it is, because it's unregulated, is the companies selling these credit default swaps and reaping all kinds of money coming in are not required to maintain cash reserves with which to pay a reasonably expected number of claims. That's what happened with AIG. When the mortgage-backed security fraud burst and collapsed, AIG had sold all these credit default swaps against these mortgage bundles. They all came due. AIG didn't have the money. It all collapsed. The same thing is hovering over Europe. When we come back from the commercial break, I'll explain exactly. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about this article over in the Telegraph, how the International Monetary Fund is concerned over the Federal Reserve possibly tapering their quantitative easing. Right now, the Federal Reserve is creating $85 billion a month out of thin air to shower all over Wall Street to keep them solvent, to keep them from defaulting. We have reported before that a great deal of this money is actually being sent over to Europe to prop up their banks to keep them from defaulting. And the reason the Federal Reserve is doing that is in order to forestall these credit default swaps coming due. Now, it's estimated Wall Street has sold an aggregate somewhere around $90 trillion, with a T, dollars worth of credit default swaps against Europe's debt. And we now seem to have a situation, and this is bolstered by the story out of the Telegraph, that the European banking community is now dependent on this flow of instantly created dollars from the Federal Reserve in order to keep their balance sheets in the black. And if the Federal Reserve were to stop hyperinflating the U.S. dollar, European banks would start to collapse. Those credit default swaps sold by Wall Street would come due, and there would be fists pounding on the doors of Wall Street saying, give us the money. You sold us the credit default swaps. The credit that they were sold on has defaulted. We now want our money. Of course, Wall Street will turn around to the U.S. government and say, we really meant well. We didn't do anything wrong. Please take another $1 trillion from the American people and bail us out again. And the U.S. government will say, yes, sir, we will do that. Except, of course, we, the American people, don't have it. We're out of money out here. The money junkies really did get it all. There isn't enough currency floating out here to sustain commerce and business. I have seen whole networks of businesses go out of business while everybody's waiting for somebody else along the line to get some cash in to pay overdue bills. So there's really no way out of this but collapse, and they're just trying to stretch it out as long as possible. Obama wants the crash to happen after he's no longer in the White House. House of Representatives want the crash to happen after the next 2 years when most of them are not going to be in the House anymore. It's been the attitude for 200 years. We know this system will crash eventually. We just have to make sure it crashes on somebody else's administration to preserve our historical legacy. And so now, despite all the talk about cooling the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing in order to reduce inflationary pressure on the prices you and I are paying for food and gas and electricity and everything, no, they're going to crank up those printing presses. They're going to put turbocharged V12 engines on those presses and keep that going, because the entire system is now hooked on this constant influx of newly created money, all of it technically a loan to the American people to be repaid by the future slave labor of your great, by now it's great grandchildren. That's the model. That's the reason they phonied up the 16th Amendment in order to allow the Federal Reserve to operate by collateralizing U.S. government debt with future slave labor of the American people. That's exactly what the system was set up to do. So now the IMF is out there saying the Federal Reserve can't stop quantitative easing. Europe's banks are dependent on that money. The system has already failed. It's dead. can't detect brain activity anywhere in the global private central banking. It's on life support, supported by you, the people of the United States of America, supported by the people of Europe. We need more austerities. Like Obama was saying the other day, everybody must make sacrifices to keep this brain-dead carcass of private central banking on life support for another few weeks. There comes a time when you have to pull the plug, when you realize there is no way to get the patient to live again. And it's time to pull the plug on private central banking before it kills all of us alongside, especially if they get their nuclear war. Alrighty, let's see. Moving right along, we were talking about GMOs. We've been talking about fracking an awful lot. It seems to be expanding beyond control. And just as we saw with big tobacco, shouting down people saying that commercially produced cigarettes were linked to cancer, which we now know is true. Just like we saw all kinds of people saying, oh, all that oil and Corexit in the Gulf of Mexico, it's not going to affect the seafood. And President Obama went down there with his daughter and took a swim in a swimming pool that was really very, very close to the Gulf of Mexico to prove it was all safe. Just like we saw with all these pharmaceutical companies who are out there saying, there is no link between SSRIs and depression and suicide and violence. We're seeing the fracking industry out there with their public relations firms trying to insist, oh no, this is all perfectly 100% safe. And there are reasons to suspect that that's simply not true. Now, there's that wonderful series of documentaries, Gasland and Gasland Part 2. I think Gasland Part 2 is still on HBO. Showing all these problems. And the oil company's entire claim of safety is, oh, we're drilling too deep, we're sheathing everything in cement, it's all perfectly safe and there are no leaks, and yet it's clearly documentable. The concrete is cracking, the pipes are corroding, they're not spending the money to buy the best quality, most durable materials. And the methane is leaking out. And by the way, for all you carbon Nazis, methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. In fact, remember, NASA just released a study showing that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't really perform in a greenhouse fashion. It's actually a coolant. But you've got all this methane coming out of these fracking wells that is far more potent at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. But those carbon Nazis aren't going to say anything about that because their goal is to get you to pay a carbon tax. They don't want to tax the oil and gas companies. My goodness, how silly of you to think about that. And we've raised the possibility. We know about all the examples of methane gas coming out of water taps, drinking water, and the fracking chemicals themselves, some of which are the same chemicals used in biological weapons, chemical weapons. And it's coming out of the tap water, and the fracking industry say, that's nonsense. We raised the possibility that this methane coming out of the ground is why certain parts of the country are now devoid of wild birds. You know the old story about the canary in the coal mine. The reason for that is that birds with their higher metabolism succumb much more quickly to methane than humans. So coal miners or any miners would take a canary in a little cage down into the mine and they'd keep an eye on the canary. If the canary fell over dead, they knew they had to get out there. Because methane doesn't have an odor. They have to add the stink smell to it before it's sold as natural gas into your homes. Can you imagine somebody going to college and getting a 4-year degree in chemistry and that's their job? What do you do for a living there? I put the stinky stuff in natural gas. We also know about all these strange fish die-offs we're seeing in lakes and rivers all over America, where they come back and they say, oh, we tested the water and there was no oxygen in the water and that's why the fish died. Well, if you're bubbling methane gas into lakes and streams through cracks in the ground, methane, when it is exposed to free oxygen, will chemically combine with it to produce more water molecules and carbon dioxide. And it will deplete the water of all available oxygen, which will kill the fish. So we're seeing signs between the death of wild birds and all of these lakes and rivers where the fish are just mass dying and washing up on shore as signs that fracking is seriously, seriously toxifying the United States of America and any place else where it's being used. But because the United States is now fully a corporatocracy, we're going to hear the corporate media and the government say, really, you shouldn't worry about that. It's another phony scandal that everybody's paying too much attention to, like NSA Gate and the rest of it. And I have a word for you in government and the corporate media. If we're right, and the methane and these other chemicals are getting into the water and the air, you're breathing it too. You're drinking it too. It's not like the White House cafeteria or Monsanto's cafeteria where they can say, we actually won't sell you any GMO food. If you're in the United States, you are exposed to these toxic chemicals. And you could be condemning your own children, your own family to chronic illness, sickness, by towing the corporate line. Is it really worth the health of your own children to go on taking your little paycheck to promote the propaganda, to ridicule the critics who are asking some very valid questions? Just something to think about over the weekend. We'll be back here Monday on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay skeptical, stay informed, make good choices. Please support Republic Broadcasting. We're in a period of extreme growth. Call your local AM and FM stations. Ask them to carry our programming. We'll be back on Monday. Aloha, America.